2 weeks, the audio was great. Now, in the last 2 weeks, getting a lot of reverb. Still today.
Okay, well, I don't have speakers going, so I don't really know what would cause that. Is anybody else getting an echo on their microphone? No, okay. Using headphones today so that we don't have that speaker getting into the mic. Sorry, I don't know what your equipment is right now, and I don't know how else to change the situation because it's the same setup I had the last 2 weeks or the first 2 weeks. Soldier on, and maybe we'll buy some acoustic foam or something. Who knows? All right, so we're moving on. We were recording. Let me do a screen share. This. All right, you guys should be looking at. It says excursus, instruction on the Book of Revelation. Is that right? Okay. All right, so before we get into the passage today, we're going to take some time to dive into just the structure of this book, because it's somewhat unique. It's not the only example of this in the New Testament. It's certainly not the only example of this in the world, but it is a little unique and unfamiliar to us just because of our culture and the time period that we live in. So why even bother studying structure? Why don't we just dive right into the words, into the imagery, into the literature, and just try to, go from there? This is one of my favorite parts of Bible study, is looking at the structure of things. It's one of my favorite parts of sermon writing as well, because the structure has so much influence on a document or on a piece of literature that we oftentimes don't even recognize, because it's not always so up front, and it doesn't take center stage. It's something that kind of sits in the background, but it guides everything. Structure helps us understand the flow of what's being said. If we just had ideas that were thrown out haphazardly, we really wouldn't be able to make heads or tails of what's being said. The structure of a story is what lets us know, kind of subconsciously, what to expect, when we should be excited, when we should be nervous, when things are okay, when things are done, when things are getting started. The structure of a letter, even to some extent, kind of helps us follow what's going on. A good example of a document that doesn't have any sort of literary structure would be, you may have read it, you may not have read it. It's called the Gospel of Thomas. It's not actually a gospel at all. It's just it's kind of a quote book, just a bunch of quotes from Jesus. Not all of them are really of Jesus. It's a late document that comes during the 2nd to 3rd century. So it's, 60 to more likely probably 150 years after Jesus, and there's some Gnostic influences in there. But that's a good example of a document without any sort of structure, because it's just quotes and sayings again and again and again, and there's not really any order or rhyme or reason to it. So structure can help us understand a book and what parts are significant, what parts we might want to pay special attention to. It can utilize tools like repetition in structure. That is a good sign or red flag that, hey, this is probably something that the author intends for us to notice. So there's a lot of kind of just significance in interpretation and understanding that structure brings to the table. Another really significant part of structure, and I mentioned this just a minute ago, it emphasizes certain parts of what we read. If you're reading a story and it says, once upon a time there were 3 little pigs, and 3 little pigs left home, and one built a house of straw, and one built a house of sticks, one built a house of bricks, that structure right there, that doesn't really emphasize pigs. It could be goats, it could be people, it doesn't matter. Pigs are insignificant. But the fact that houses are emphasized 3 times, that the whole story that you're familiar with is going to break down into focusing on these houses, tells us that that's probably a focal point, something we want to pay attention to as they're building something. And even the differences in that structure, straw, sticks, and bricks, emphasizes, hey, this is probably, just based on those differences, this is going to be important to the story as well. So structure can really emphasize part of a message. In our culture, we tend to save really important points for the end. It's usually the last thing. We have that kind of grand finale sort of moment. If you've ever watched like an Apple announcement, Steve Jobs would get on stage and he would go through and he'd talk about their products, and then he would go at the end of the message, and one more thing, and that's when he would make this huge announcement about some new product they had or something revolutionary. And that was the highlight. The whole talk was structured, but we were always waiting for that last point and one more thing. Sometimes in ancient Greek literature especially, they would, like a word order, for instance, they would put really important parts at the beginning of a sentence. So, in the Greek language, the order of the words in the sentence, there's no rhyme or reason to it. Sometimes like the verb and the noun and the direct object can just be anywhere, which is really confusing. But the really important words are at the beginning of the sentence. So structure can emphasize things. If we were to look at this structure of a document as an example, Roger, you got a question? Okay, I think the raise hand button is if you have a question or a comment or something. That does show up on my screen, so I can try to address those. Or you can just interrupt me and chime in. That's fine too, because yes, Talia.
I've heard it said that the key is at the door, meaning the key to the passage or the key to the book or the key to the sentence is right at the very front.
Sometimes, not always, but that is certainly in sentence structure. In the Greek language, usually that first word, it may not be the very first word because sometimes there's like a conjunction or something, but that first word, if it's like, okay, you would expect to find that midway through the sentence, but they put it right at the beginning and it kind of stands out and seems odd, then that's usually a good indication. This is really what we want to pay attention to here. Sometimes, I can't think of the passage off the top of my head, but I know there's one verse in particular that like, it's talking about greatness, and you would expect greatness to show up kind of midway through the sentence or be a little closer to the noun that it's describing, but instead it's at the very beginning of the sentence because that's really what Paul wanted to emphasize with this is a great thing about, I'm assuming, God. Again, I can't remember the reference off the top of my head, but sometimes that is the case. So we look at this structure that we have here as an example. We've got an introduction, and then we've got, a section that says, love God with your heart. And then maybe it talks about that a little bit in some subpoint. And then it moves on, it says, love God with your mind. And it gives us some explanation of that. And love God with your soul, and love God with your strength. So if you were to sit down and look at we'll say, one of Paul's letters or something, and this is the structure that you find that you can kind of see in the letter, what do you think the main emphasis of this document as a whole would be?
Love God.
Yeah, it's in every major point. Love God. We might even get a little more specific if we've got all these different parts. Love God with all of who you are. That would, either one of those are an easy guess or probably going to be pretty close to the author's main point if this is how he structured things. Because he's trying to explain, I want you to love God with your heart, and here's how you do that. Love God with your mind, and here's how you do that, and so on. And so this is a way of emphasizing a point just based on how things are laid out. If we were to talk about, I want you to serve one another and also be kind to the poor, and in your struggles against sin, don't compromise because there's persecution. Not all those things tie together necessarily, even though they might show up at different points in this letter, to love the poor and to take care of one another and to serve one another. That would be a great love God with strength subpoint. Don't lose heart even though there's persecution. That might be a love God with all your heart or all your spirit kind of point. So having those things laid out and structured helps us understand what's being said and helps us make sense of it in a kind of a reasonable way. But it also has a way of kind of bringing out the larger message of, I just want you guys to love God with all of who you are. Does that make sense? If we were to look at like a biblical example, Philippians is a book that's pretty easy to see a structure in. Paul starts off in chapter 1. He's in prison, and he says, I don't know what's going to happen. Part of me desires to go and be with the Lord in heaven, but I know it's more pressing for me to be with you. So confident in this, I'll remain with you in the flesh, and I'll be released. And so he wants one thing, but he says it's better for you. And so I think I'm going to be released from prison. And then he goes on in chapter 2 and he says, your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus. And he gives us that phenomenal hymn of selflessness and humility in Jesus, who gave himself away for our benefit. And then in chapter 3, he says, I want to commend you, Timothy and Epaphroditus, both guys who considered your well-being above their own. And in fact, the case of Epaphroditus even risked his own life for your benefit. Are you seeing a pattern start to show up in these examples? And then in chapter 4, he says, even myself, this is what I consider. I have earthly greatness, and I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews from the tribe of Benjamin and so on. But I consider it rubbish that I may be found in Christ. And he considers what was significant in himself, setting it aside in this humble act of service as he comes to the Philippians. So he gives all these examples and lays out this structure. And then when he gets to the conclusion, he says, all right, Euodia, Syntyche, you all need to get over this, and you need to get on with life and forgive one another. And you need to consider each other's fellow workers. And he says to the rest of the church, help these fellow workmen, or these fellow workers that have contended for the gospel by my side to get past their differences. So there's this structure to this book where he's laying out examples of selflessness and humility all the way through. And he has subpoints that he's developing about community and about being citizens in heaven and so on. But all of it's kind of building to this conclusion at the end where he says, I've given you all these examples of humility. I've laid out the theology of humility. And now I want you to be humble and forgive one another. So that's kind of just a basic structure of that book. And when you know that, and then you go and you read Philippians, you can see what he's doing and how it's progressing and leading us to this point. So structure is really beneficial in helping us just make sense of all the things that are said, because they all fit into this somewhere. I already asked that question. Sorry, getting ahead of myself again. So that's why structure matters. Revelation is incredibly significant to understand the structure because there are so many weird things that show up in this book. And they almost seem to show up just haphazardly without any connection, but really there's a lot of connection between them. So there are different kinds of structure. One that we're really familiar with is a linear structure. There's an introduction, and we move on to point 1, it moves into point 2, that moves into point 3, and then things wrap up. Each of these points, involve the same idea, but they progress the conversation further. They might move on to a related point. We're starting in one place, and we're very clearly moving somewhere else with different ideas. Stories have beginnings, they have rising action, climax, falling action, conclusion. That's how every story is structured. You might have a twist in there somewhere, but every single story follows this basic structure. It's very linear. You start off, things are good, and then there's something happens, there's a conflict. That's the rising action, is most of the story. And then you get to the climax 2/3 of the way through, maybe even 5/8 of the way through, and then resolution or falling action. And that we know that. And that's why when you watch a TV show, you can look at, I've talked about this before, you can look at the runtime of a movie or a television show, and you can go, okay, we're 45 minutes into this. This is going to be the highlight of the episode, and then the last 15 minutes are going to be the resolution and falling action. Sorry, that's going to ruin any sort of story or movie for you in the future. So this is very common for us in the West. And I say that, you can go back to kind of Elizabethan England. You can go back, trying to think of other story structures. You can go back to some extent, even the poem of Beowulf, one of those first written works of fiction. It follows this sort of linear structure to some extent. Charles Dickens, you go back even further than that. You can go to Dostoevsky, if I said his name right. You can go to just as far back as you want to go in Western literature. This is usually the structure of things. If you read academic literature or you read journalism today, this is going to be almost always be the structure of things, because this is just how Western post-Enlightenment minds work. We go progression in a structure. Letters, even biblical letters like the epistles to some extent, this is, especially in Paul, they tend to have a linear structure. You have a beginning, and then you're moving forward, and you're moving on to related but distinct points or ideas that are connected by theme, and they're moving a conversation forward to a particular end, but they are distinct in themselves. Sermons, almost every sermon I've ever preached, and most sermons in the last 200 years, follow a linear structure. In fact, it's usually 3 points in a poem is what we call it, because you start off with a poem, you got 3 points, you land the plane, everybody shakes hands, we go home. That's just how we think in the West. That's not the only kind of structure that exists in the world of literature, though. Something that's a little more foreign to us in the West, but far more common in Eastern literature and in Eastern minds, even still today. And when I say Eastern, I don't just mean necessarily, China, Japan, Korea, those, I mean like the Middle East, parts of Africa, that Eastern part of the world, is a cyclical structure. A cyclical structure is a little different. It's annoying to people like me that just want to get to the point, because a cyclical structure will have an introduction, and then it will introduce a point, and then it will just kind of talk around the idea and mull over it and reintroduce it, and it'll use different terms, and it may look at it from a different perspective, but we're just talking about one idea. And it'll just, I compare it to the way that a cow chews its cud. A cow eats, swallows, it goes down, it comes back up. We're going to chew on it for a little bit while. It's going to go down, it's going to come back up. That's how a cyclical structure works. You'll have point one, let's say, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Whereas a linear structure would break that down, and we would go heart, soul, mind, strength. A cyclical structure would say, let's love God with all of our being. And we'll talk about how we can do that. And then, let's love God with all of our being some more. And let's love God with all of who we are yet again. And it's just going to kind of roll over this again and again. And then it is going to wrap up eventually. And like I said, this is still somewhat common in Eastern cultures today. In seminary, I had a classmate whose family was from Egypt. And his grandfather, as we were studying this, he raised his hand. He said, "This is exactly how my grandfather still talks today. He'll tell a story and he'll just kind of talk around it. And it's like, are we really going anywhere? I just feel like we're circling the drain again and again." But every time you come back around to this idea, it takes on kind of new significance, or takes on kind of a different nuance, but you're still just talking around something. A good example of this from the Bible is the way that the Apostle John writes, which is why this is going to be significant to our study today. If you were to read 1 John, I'll tell the story. So in one of my preaching classes in college, I had this assignment: just pick a book from the Bible, could have picked any book, and write a 6-part sermon series. So I picked the book of 1 John. So I was like, I've never preached through 1 John before. That's a huge mistake. There are 5 chapters in the book of 1 John, so I thought this will be easy. But there's really just like 3 ideas that get repeated again and again and again. Love God, or it starts off really with God loved us through Christ. And to love Christ is to love the brothers. If you love the brothers, then you love God. But God loved you, or we love God because he first loved us in Christ. So if you love God, love the brothers. And loving the brothers is proof that you love God. And remember that God loved you first in Christ. And it's just this big circle again and again. And trying to find 6 different sermons in that was a huge pain in the tuchus. But that's the way that John writes, because he's in this Eastern culture. And he kind of has this idea in the book of 1 John. And it's easier to see there because it's shorter. And he just sort of talks around the idea of loving God and loving one another again and again and again. That's a cyclical structure. If you want to use a $5 word, it's what we call recapitulation. It recapitulates, it circles back around on top of itself. So that's a cyclical structure. Any questions about that before we get into Revelation? Okay, you've probably talked to people who think in a cyclical way before. If you've talked to people that just sort of circle the drain with a conversation and they just keep revisiting points again and again, that's kind of an experience of a cyclical structure to a conversation. To them, it makes sense and everything is kind of connected and you're going somewhere. But if you're wired like me and you're kind of structured type A, let's get to the point, it's challenging to have those conversations. And it's just not how your brain probably thinks. Okay, so Revelation. Is Revelation linear? Is it cyclical? That makes a huge, it may not sound like an important question, but it actually plays a huge part in how we interpret a significant chunk of this book. Not all of it, but basically the whole middle 2/3. If Revelation is linear, then we have an introduction, and then we would have, it's the structure of the book is you have your introduction, which we finished up last week through chapter 5. You've got a series of 7 seals, a series of 7 trumpets, a series of 7 bowls, and then you have kind of this large conclusion section that starts roughly, I think 17. Let me check real quick. Yeah, roughly chapter 17 kind of starts the concluding section of Revelation. So if this is linear, then what we have is our introduction, and then we have 7 seals that are their own thing, and then 7 trumpets that are their own thing, and 7 bowls that are their own thing, and then we have this concluding section. And so what we would actually have is more of a chronological view of this Revelation. 7 seals, trumpets, and bowls, they're all different events culminating in Christ's return and victory because we're moving linearly. Or linearly, is that the word? We're moving in a linear fashion. So a linear structure would seem to indicate that this is chronological, that as John is telling this, he's seeing one thing after the other. There's some difficulties with that when we start to really get into the scenes and some of the similarities. Last week, I recommended that if you were looking for homework, I didn't say we had to do it, but if you're looking for something to compare these 3 series of 7 and to note any similarities. Did anybody have time to do that this week? Did you notice anything in comparing these 3?
They would go through 6. There was generally a pause, and then they go through the last one.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed like it was different views of the same thing, maybe from a different perspective.
They're very similar, aren't they? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of the same language. They're very different. And yet there are some imagery that is consistent between all 3 series. And kind of the way that they unfold is very similar as well. And so if these are supposed to be 3 very distinct things, we have some difficulties. The first is that we're not going to get to it today, but in chapter 7, there's going to be this great multitude of people in white robes that come from every tribe and nation and every tongue, and they stand in heaven. And this looks an awful lot like God's victorious people in heaven, but it can't be because we're not at the end of the book yet. So who are these people is a question we have to answer. And people have come up with answers because this is one structure that people read and they interpret the book by. And so people have come up with explanations for that. We have a very similar event in chapter 14, where again, we have a multitude of people dressed in white robes that are victorious and that are called those that have overcome or have come out of the great tribulation. And in a lot of wording and imagery, they look very similar to the people from chapter 7, and they're going to look very similar to the victorious people at the end of the book. But again, they can't be God's victorious people yet because we're not at the end of the story. We still have to get through 7 bowls and then our conclusion. So who is this group of people? And I think in chapter 14, even, they're called the 144,000, which we were introduced into in chapter 7 as well. So is this the same group of people? That's difficult to say if we're moving progressively chronologically through time. There's some challenge there. Again, it's one that people have embraced and offered explanations for. Another scene is that we seem to see the world end 3 different times. Every time we come to this, I'm going to call it an interlude, like Talia mentioned, we have 6 of the things that happen, and then there's this pause, and then there's the 7. Every time we get to this interlude, there seems to be this scene that looks like God's total victory. In fact, we'll look at chapter 7 right now. So we have this great multitude of people that are in white robes from every tongue, tribe, and nation, and they sing a song, and then John, or one of the men, the people figures in heaven, says to John, "Who are these people?" Kind of this rhetorical question. Chapter 7, verse 14, John says, "Sir, you know." And he said, "These are those who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore," and this I don't know if we want to call this a song or poem or hymn or what, but what John says next, pay close attention to the wording. "They are before the throne of God, and they serve him day and night in his temple. He who sits on the throne will spread his tent over them. Never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat upon them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe every tear from their eye." Compare that to what we read God say in what is unquestionably his final victory statement in chapter 21. "Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, mourning, crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who is seated on the throne said, I'm making all things new." If we were to go to the end of the book, chapter 22, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who've washed their robes." We heard that in chapter 7. "They have right to the tree of life, and they go through the gates of the city." That's not the part I wanted. Basically, they're free to drink from this river of life that you might say living water that is running through the center of the city. So we have this imagery of you can drink freely from this river of life. I'm wiping every tear from your eye. You're going to be in my presence. That's kind of the same stuff that was said in chapter 7 in this victory hymn, which makes us think this is maybe the same scene. We have something else happen very similar in that middle section. So what we see this victory lap of God essentially show up almost 3 different times in this book. How is that possible if this is a chronological thing? There's some challenges to linear structure and understanding this as this thing happens and this thing and so on. I'm not saying that it's not possible. I just don't think that's the best explanation for what we're looking at, especially given that John has already shown us in 1 John that he can and does write in this cyclical kind of way. Revelation as a cyclical book. And I'm sorry if this is a little dull to some of us. I know that this is probably not what we're hoping for when we say we're going to study the book of Revelation, but this really does make so much difference in how we interpret the book. So if Revelation is cyclical, then what we have here is an introduction, chapters 1 through 5, essentially what we've covered, which brings us to these 7 seals. And these 7 seals describe, I don't even want to say events, but they describe a period or kind of speak to God's judgment as 7 seals. And then we have 7 trumpets that are going to show up. And that's the same, you call it period, the same statement about God's judgment, but it's just restated in a little different language, a little more vivid language. It kind of intensifies. And then we get to the 7 bowls, which is saying the exact same thing as the 7 seals and 7 trumpets, but again, it's using different imagery and language to expand and intensify those ideas even more. And then we move into a conclusion in chapter 17 and following. So if we have this structure, we have one period of the world, we'll call it the world's end, God's judgment, and the rewarding of the saints. But it's shown in 3 different ways, to some extent, kind of from 3 different angles. But every time it's demonstrated, things get a little bigger, things get a little more vivid, they get a little more intense. And it's really just kind of John's way of hammering this point home again and again, almost kind of building to a crescendo where we get to God's total victory in chapter 17 through 22. That would be what this book would seem to be saying if it's structured in this cyclical way. And even then, we probably shouldn't see these 7 individual items in the series of 7. We probably shouldn't see them necessarily as individual events, because what is 7 in numerology that we've talked about? Does it have any significance?
God's perfection.
Yeah, it's a number of perfection, of completeness, of wholeness. And so what we have here is probably not a coincidence that we've got 7 items or articles of judgment that are displayed here. Maybe instead of looking at them as individual specific events, it's better to see them as a collective whole and to say, this is what God's complete or total or fulfilled judgment looks like. And in that same extent, this opposite side of the coin, this is what God's complete and total victory looks like, and his blessing to his people. That sounds foreign to us maybe in some ways, because it's just not real familiar in how in the literature that we read today or in the stories that we watch or consume. However, that, even though it's a little foreign to us, kind of alleviates a lot of the issues we mentioned earlier of seeing so much similarity in these 3 series, in seeing this great multitude of people that every time seems to look like God's victorious people. It's not an issue that they show up 3 times, because 3 different times John is kind of showing us a picture of what God's victory in the saints looks like. So any questions before we sum that up? Okay, so if we have a linear view, then it's 7 individual things followed by 7 individual things. I should have sped this transition up. 7 individual things. That is one way that sometimes people read this book, and it leads to some interesting interpretations, because you have to kind of do some gymnastics at times to explain how something that seems so similar is actually different. Probably a better explanation for how this book is laid out is to see these as synonymous cycles. We've got 7 seals, and they are the 7 trumpets, and they are the 7 bowls, but it's just told to us 3 different times. And in this, John is kind of maybe explaining to these churches that are reading this, look, I know that you're oppressed, and I know that you're struggling, but victory is coming, and it looks like the 7 seals broken off of the Danielic scroll that we read about so long ago, and it looks like 7 trumpets hailing in God's victory for his people, and it looks like 7 bowls of wrath being poured out in judgment over the wicked. And it just kind of paints this picture of, almost from different perspectives to some extent, it gives us different nuance, I guess, to just kind of mull over, what does God's victory in this world look like? What does judgment of evil look like? What does our victory as saints look like in different ways? So I'm maybe you're not convinced, and that's okay. I'm going to approach this book as if it is written in a cyclical structure, because I think that does the best job of addressing just the different details that we see. So with that said, kind of a breakdown. Chapters 1 through 5 are kind of the introduction. It's the letters to the churches, the throne room scene. That's what we've covered so far. It's going to be followed by a series of 7 seals. Keep an eye on the time. And that's chapter 6 through 17. We're going to, or through verse 17. We're going to see 6 of those seals broken, and we're going to see what comes about. And then, as Celia mentioned, there seems to be this pause. There's this interlude that shows up between verse 17 and then the beginning of chapter 8, so chapter 7, essentially. And the theme of that interlude really is this call to endure. It's a message spoken, not that it steps out of the story, but it almost kind of breaks the fourth wall a little bit, in that John is kind of telling us this vision and there's this story unfolding, and then he turns to the churches and he says, endure in some ways. And then we get a glimpse of the 7th seal in chapter 8. That's the first series, the seal series. And then chapter 8, we're going to have a series of trumpets introduced to us. And there's going to be 6 trumpets that are sounded. And then in chapter 10, there's going to be an interlude. And in that interlude, again, really the theme to the churches is endure, overcome, be victorious. And then we're going to have that 7th trumpet. So you can see there's kind of a pattern showing up in the structure already. Here's where things get a little different. We're going to have a break from our series of 7. We're going to have this interlude in which, and this is probably my favorite part of the book, this is where the curtain really gets pulled back, because so far we've seen peoples of the earth and we've seen what's going on, and we've seen, some conversations happening in heaven. In chapter 12, it's almost like we've been seeing what's on stage, but the curtain comes back and now we see everything that's been going on behind the scenes. And we're introduced to a dragon, and we're introduced to 2 great beasts, and we're introduced to a harlot, and we're introduced to Babylon. And we see there is this kind of celestial struggle that's been happening this entire time, while these churches are dealing with kind of an earthly manifestation of spiritual warfare. That's probably my favorite book, and my favorite part of the book. And I think that it really is a powerful reminder to us to envision our struggles and difficulties and happenings in the world today in terms of this kind of spiritual world and spiritual interaction. And after that's done, we're going to get 7 bowls. It's going to be introduced with 6 bowls, and then there's going to be an interlude. And guess what the theme of that interlude is? Same thing as the other 2, endure, overcome, and then we're going to wrap up with the 7th bowl. And then, like I said, in chapter 17, we really start the conclusion of the book. In some ways, it's the climax, and in some ways, it's the conclusion. God's victory over Satan, the redemption of the saints, new heavens, new earth, and then the call at the end to overcome. So that's kind of just a breakdown of how this book looks, or how we're going to address it in this cyclical fashion. Questions about any of that before we move on? No? Okay. So to wrap it up, Revelation probably is written cyclically. We should not try to fit chronological events from history into this story. Resist that temptation. That's a really popular idea that has sold a lot of books. In fact, in 1987, there's a guy that wrote a book called 87 Reasons Why Jesus Will Come Back in 1987. He sold a ton of copies. In 1988, he released a revised version called 88 Reasons. Didn't sell so hot. Not a lot of people bought that one. People have kind of fed into this at times to try to fit historical events from history chronologically into this book. That's just not how it's written. That's not what it's intended to be. 7 seals, 7 trumpets and scrolls probably should be understood as the same period or the same statement. Even again, I hesitate to call them events, because it's not necessarily, I don't really think it is 7 different events. Really, this is just a total statement of God's judgment is like this. And it's like this, and it's like this. And they really function together to paint this picture. We said in our last session, sometimes the individual details matter, but sometimes it's really about the bigger scene that they paint together that John wants us to just stand in awe of. And that's, in my estimation, probably what we're looking at here. A little pause. This is a book I've mentioned before. It's called Revelation Rhapsody by Robert Lowry. He is or was formerly a professor of New Testament at Lincoln Christian University. He is since deceased and gone to be with the Lord. But it's a great book on how to read the book of Revelation. It does a phenomenal job about explaining the structure, maybe some of the presuppositions that we come to with this book that we should avoid. It talks a lot about the imagery, how it draws so much from the Old Testament. It's really a great read on just how, it doesn't really interpret the book at all, but it just is how we should go about reading this book. It's really, really good. All right, so that's it for structure. Any questions before we get into the text this morning? Okay, clear as mud. Everybody got it? Okay, we're experts now. Just to make sure I did this right, you should be seeing a new presentation, Revelation 6. Is that what's on the screen right now? Great. Okay, well, with that underway, let's get into these seals. We're not going to get through all 7 today. Hopefully we can get through 5, maybe even 6. We'll see how great we can do. All right, recap. Whoop. That's not what I wanted. Let's try that again. There we go. Okay, so a recap of what we have been through so far. In this introduction, the resurrected Jesus has appeared to the Apostle John, who is exiled on the island of Patmos. He has spoken to John this message he intends for 7 churches of Asia Minor to receive. And after he's kind of written those down, he is transported and taken in the Spirit to this vision of the heavenly throne room and just what it looks like. And we've talked about the significance, just kind of the awe of that moment. It serves as kind of this counterpoint to all the chaos and hardship that people are enduring on earth. And then we talked about this scroll. There's this scroll that probably is representative or is in some ways the same thing that we saw in the book of Daniel. It's God's plan for judgment and for redemption and for history that he has spoken and ordained, but it's all bound up with these seals that nobody has the authority to break. And then here comes the Lamb. He's hailed as the lion, but John turns around, he looks like a lamb, and he's a lamb that had been slain. Had been, past tense, that's important. Because he was slain, he is now worthy. So this is Jesus, obviously, and he's given authority to enact God's plan of judgment and redemption, to open the scroll. And that's where we left off last week. So we're going to start in chapter 6, verse 1. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. And then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." And I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. So there were 4 living creatures we saw in the throne room of God. We said they're covered in eyes, and here we see that really the function of these things, other than praising God, is they are kind of emissaries of his judgment. When Jesus opens the seals, he doesn't say come. It's one of the creatures that says, okay, next, So then this white horseman shows up. Little history lesson. I think this is really interesting because it's not something that we talk about a whole lot. We talk about the Roman Empire a great deal, not just in church, but in history. And Rome is always hailed as, one of the greatest empires in the ancient world, and it was in a lot of ways. But it wasn't the only empire in the ancient world, obviously, and certainly wasn't the only empire that existed even in this biblical time period. The Roman Empire would be this stuff in red or pink here. So expansive, pretty great. But just to its eastern border, we have another empire, the Parthian Empire, which is nothing to balk at. It's a sizable territory. And honestly, at this time period, it was probably the greatest threat to the Roman Empire other than itself. What's that? Okay. In the years leading up to the book of Revelation, which was roughly 90 to 100 AD, Rome had engaged in a number of battles with Parthians. And like we said, the Parthians were considered probably the greatest threat to the Roman Empire. If anybody were to conquer Rome, it would be them. And so they were greatly feared, especially among people who are on the eastern border. So just out of curiosity, who knows where Asia Minor is? It's right in here, not too terribly far from this eastern border. And so while there's a little bit of buffer here, there's also not a whole lot of buffer here. Antioch would be roughly in this region here, and that would be a very quick path then into Asia Minor. So there's a lot of reason for these 7 churches to kind of be leery or to be a little wary of Parthians and rumors of Parthians. Something that's unique about Parthians is were their soldiers. Most armies at this time would employ archers. The archers would be kept kind of to the cavalry. They stayed in the back from the main units. But Parthians were one of the first to employ horseback or riding archers, and that's kind of in this little statue right here. This is actually a Parthian soldier, a little statue of that. And so these Parthians would ride on horseback, and they would fire their bow and arrow, and were able to be incredibly mobile and to get all over the battlefield on them, which made them incredibly effective. Parthian archers, in fact, were so well renowned, they kind of became the symbol of the Parthian army. They were just well-known symbols. And if you had to take a guess, what color do you think Parthia, just based on our biblical text, Parthia oftentimes identified itself by? It was white. White was considered a very sacred color to them, and so a lot of times, most of the times, they would ride white horses into battle. That's another part of this image that was very common with Parthia. And so white riders with bow and arrow in hand was a symbol that would strike terror into Roman hearts, because that was the symbol of, if there was going to be conquest, it was going to be Parthia. So let's go back to our text a little bit, and let's just think for a moment. If one of our greatest fears are white riders with bow and arrows, and John is talking about this image or this vision from Jesus, and part of God's judgment is this rider on a white horse with a bow and arrow in hand, what kind of message does that send to us? What kind of emotions might we have had to that, or emotional reactions?
Anxiety.
Mm. It's a little different, but if somebody right now were to walk into, a government building or into a major shopping center with a T-shirt that said "Made in Wuhan," what would people's reaction be?
Flee.
Terror, right? Like this is a scary thing, and that's kind of what this image would have done to people in Asia Minor. We live in the greatest nation on the face of the earth, the greatest empire that's ever existed. Oh, but here comes a symbol of the one guy that we're all afraid of in the back of our mind that's going to bring all this crumbling down around us. Conquest is not something that anybody welcomes, but particularly in Rome, where the emperor is continually touting himself as the one who has brought peace and has created this incredible empire unlike anything that's ever existed. The idea of conquest, if you lived by the eastern borders, you realize that it was a possibility. And so the idea of conquest really just strikes at the heart of Roman pride in a lot of way. Now, this symbol of a white rider with a bow and arrow, it's not meant to be a prediction to say Parthia will conquer Rome. Historically, that never happened, but that was the great threat at the time. Rather, this symbol is meant to just kind of convey to people that there would be a time when Rome would fall. It's not an invincible juggernaut. It's going to collapse. And it would be conquered just as every other kingdom that had ever come before it was conquered. You think of the book of Daniel, that statue that Nebuchadnezzar has a vision of, the statue with bronze feet represents Babylon, or bronze head, I don't remember which one it is. But there's a part of it that represents Babylon. And Babylon was this immense empire. Oh, who could ever conquer Babylon? Well, Persia could. And Persia then becomes this global empire that is huge, and Xerxes hails himself as a god. Who could ever conquer the Persian Empire? Well, Greece could. And Alexander the Great came in and he made short work of the Persian Empire, and he claimed it for Greece. Alexander the Great, one of the greatest military minds that had ever existed. Who could possibly conquer the Greek Empire? Well, Alexander died, and then they conquered themselves. They split into the Ptolemies and Seleucids. And at that point, here are these great empires. We even have a guy from the Seleucid Empire named Antiochus Epiphanes, who Jesus kind of references, who Daniel kind of references, who comes in because he's so tired of Jewish upheaval, and he just desecrates the Jewish temple immensely, sacrifices a pig in there, and he tries to claim it for a temple of Zeus. Oh man, who could ever overthrow a guy that powerful and that brazen? Judas Maccabeus, one of the Jewish leaders that we don't read about because he shows up in the intertestamental period. Every empire thinks itself to be phenomenal and inconquerable, but all of them fall, even Rome. And so conquest is just this coming thing that people need to be aware of. Here's the important part of this. Who is the conqueror in this scene? This rider on a white horse. Ultimately, it's Jesus. I know that sounds odd because Jesus isn't a rider. Well, he is later, but this rider on a white horse, it represents Parthia, this great threat in the Roman psyche. Ultimately, Jesus is the only one that can open the scroll. And Jesus is the one whose actions hail this coming conquest. He's actually at the wheel here, and that's the important part of this scene. Conquest is this immense fear that even our nation has at some point. If you tell some people that the United States is not going to last forever and it's not always going to be a global powerhouse, they freak out and lose their minds, even though historically speaking, it's not a matter of if but when. That's just the way it is. It's the way history goes. Conquest is a great fear for people. And what we see here is that every conquest that we've seen, that we talked about and mentioned in the ancient world, and every conquest that will ever happen, ultimately is not a thing that happens independent of this great plan of God's that's all sealed up that Jesus is enacting. So this image here is not just, hey, conquest is coming, buckle up, guys, but it's to say that conquest, when it comes, is not something that is separate from God's will, God's sovereignty, God's authority. In fact, it's an instrument. It's part of his plan that's unfolding. So if conquest is part of God's judgment, and when I say judgment, I don't mean like God's picking out people individually and being like, ha, gotcha. That's not what we need to imagine. Judgment is just what God does. He is a judge. He distinguishes between good and evil, righteous and unrighteous. That's his part of his being, his prerogative. So judgment is kind of is more of an emotionally neutral term. So if conquest of Rome was to function as part of its judgment, who would it be judgment against? That's what we have to consider.
The emperors who allowed all the persecutions of the Christians.
Yeah, at the very top of the pyramid, you've got one guy that hails himself as divine. He's certainly going to face judgment because what kind of God can't stop conquest from coming into his nation? But who else? It's really against the entire empire and against those that align themselves with it. When we talk about empire, we could either be referencing a popular television show, or we could be referencing this concept of, that's a joke, maybe people get it, maybe don't. We're referencing really a concept. in the biblical world, if you want to take like Luke chapter 2, for instance, the Christmas narrative, or the nativity narrative, the birth of Jesus, we kind of talked about this on Christmas Eve this past year, which I'm sure you all remember word for word because it was just like yesterday. But really, Luke is talking about a lot more than just a miraculous birth. There are comparisons between Caesar Augustus and Jesus and the kinds of kingdoms that are being portrayed here. There's a clash happening in Luke chapter 2 because Caesar thought himself a god. Caesar demanded to be Lord. Caesar demanded praise. Caesar demanded worship. Caesar thought that he was the one that had hailed in the great peace. And yet here we have this little baby infant who doesn't wield power or authority that way, who's bringing a different kind of kingdom. And he is the one who brings peace, and he is the one who actually receives worship, and he is the one who's rightfully called Lord. So there's a clash here of kingdoms. John chapter 16, I don't remember the chapter, but Jesus before Pilate, Pilate pulls him aside and says, are you a king? He says, my kingdom's not of this earth, or as you say, but my kingdom's not of this earth. Essentially, Jesus is trying to say, yeah, I am a king. You don't need to worry about it because it's not the kind of king you're thinking about. But I am a king, and there's a clash of kingdoms here. The reason Jesus was executed was not because he claimed to be the Messiah. It's because his claims of authority, of being called king, of saying I'm bringing a kingdom, were seen as sort of treason against the Roman Empire. The only people to be crucified weren't just like, even the thieves. Those weren't just thieves. Those were insurrectionists. They were associated with Barabbas. And the words that are used there in the historical accounts, Barabbas had like a political assassination, basically. And these thieves were identified with him. So they were insurrectionists. It was of a political nature. That's why Jesus was executed. So there's always this clash of kingdoms in the biblical narratives. So if Rome is going to be judged, if it's going to be conquered, the emperor certainly is going to bear a brunt of that. But everybody that is aligned with the emperor, everyone that says who is like the beast, everyone who bends their knee in the imperial cult and worships Caesar, this whole culture that's permeated this empire that is antithetical to God and who he is and what he stands for, that's what's going to be judged in conquest. That's a lot. I rambled a little bit there. I'm going to preach a lot from here on out. Sorry. So Rome was this competing kingdom, and we actually said all these things. I got ahead of myself. Sorry. So it's this whole system, or this whole, what John calls the world in the Gospels. God so loved the world, meaning the people of the world, but at the same time, the world is this competing realm, this competing system of ideas and ideologies, as opposed to God's people and the sheep. And that's really what's happening here, is there's judgment on this world system. So if we were persecuted Christians, like those that we read about in chapters 2 and 3, and that persecution could come in the form of physical abuse, it could come in the form of social isolation or rejection, it could come in the form of difficult economic times. How might we welcome this judgment on Rome, or why might we welcome it?
Relief.
To some extent, especially those that are being physically abused and threatened. There's this idea that, okay, those that persecute me, or those that seek to slay me, will themselves, experience the sword, or in this case, the bow and arrow. What else? Let's talk about the imperial cult and the festivals that they would have, or even in Thyatira, those guild meetings where they'd have to go to these temples and worship these gods in order to get work, essentially. If my livelihood, my family's livelihood is being threatened or marginalized because the greater society insists on worshiping idols and false gods, to me, it's going to kind of be a statement of vindication, or an act of vindication, to see all of those false gods come crumbling down. And the same thing with the imperial cult. Here is somebody who, because I don't worship this self-proclaimed God, and his arrogance. I've basically been thrown to the side of society. People think I'm weird. They force me out of my religious communities. They abuse me. They really, I just don't have a place in this world. And it's not because of who I am. It's because of this man and who he claims to be. To see that falsehood struck down and humiliated, there would be a little bit of vindication there. And by the way, vindication is not a bad thing to feel, especially whenever, I'm going to say this is, I'm going to tread lightly here, righteous vindication. If the reason why I suffer or am afflicted is because I refuse to bow my knee to anything except the one true God, it's okay to feel vindication, and it's important to be vindicated. Jesus even, the resurrection was so important, not just because of the hope that it brings to us and the promise that it makes to us. That was God's vindication of Jesus. He was executed as a liar. He was executed as a traitor. He was executed and put in the ground, and really because he was denied. But being raised back from the grave, that was God's way of saying, no, he is everything he claimed to be. And so that vindication of people is part of God's justice, the setting of all things right. Kind of was what Jesus said to the church in Philadelphia. I'll make those who are synagogue of Satan, or say that they're a synagogue but are not, I'll make them confess that I have loved you. That's a powerful moment. Yeah, we might feel vindicated. We might feel like God hasn't forgotten our plight. We receive justice. We might get that relief, from physical persecution. So, we might welcome judgment on the Roman Empire if we lived there at that time with open arms. However, it's not like it's going to be the Passover where the Parthian soldiers come in and say, oh, well, you don't worship the emperor, so we're going to move past your house. In conquest and war, everybody suffers, regardless of their religious affiliation. So wouldn't that impact Christian people as well, something like conquest? And it's just, yeah, if there's a war to break out today, it's not like people would discriminate between those they liked and didn't like in the United States. If you fly under that flag, regardless of your feelings about whatever we're angry about, you're going to suffer. And so just because there's this God's judgment comes upon this godless empire doesn't mean that God's people are somehow not going to experience the fallout or the consequences of that. So that comes to this second half of this statement, and this is kind of the pattern we're going to follow with these horsemen. We're going to look at it through the lens of judgment, but also through the lens of redemption, because that's part of God's plan too. So if a foreign nation invaded and brought hardship on your life, how would your relationship with God be impacted? What would you do?
I would hope it would strengthen it.
Is everybody going to react that way?
No.
No, not at all. A lot of people are going to turn away. They're going to say, God abandoned us. If he really is God, why are we experiencing this hardship? If I'm trying to think of it, well, okay. Especially those that would associate God with our particular nation. And by the way, I'm going to make a lot of political, and not like current political, but political in nature statements with the association between God and the United States. I love the United States. I love living here, okay? I'm not anti-American. But our faith is not synonymous with the United States of America. And that's kind of been a faux pas of the past. This is slowly starting to be corrected. But we just need to be aware of that, because nationalism is a seductress, the same way that materialism is at times. So some would say God has abandoned us, especially if you have a nationalistic faith and you say, the United States is God's chosen people, or something of that nature. You might say, well, if this is the case, then where is God? Why would he let that happen? Others would say, God, this terrible thing's happening. I need help. I need you in this moment, because you're the only one that can really save me. And this is how people respond to hardship of any nature, really. Some people lean away from God, some people lean into God. Trial and hardship can be refining, and they can purify us. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6. And he's speaking to persecuted people that are beginning to experience hardship. And all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, greater than its worth in gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. So this crucible of hardship is really for the refining of our faith, the refining of our commitment. Hopefully those with genuine faithfulness to God would lean in and realize, God, I understand that this hardship is happening and I need you now. So just a little summary of conquest. From a judgment perspective, conquest brings judgment on the unbelieving and those systems competing with God, those parts of our world system and our culture that are antithetical to who he is or that lead us astray. And this is, those oppressed by these systems are vindicated, which is an important thing. At the same time, though, hardship has this ability to expose the genuineness of our faith to some extent. And it really is a make or break trial by fire kind of thing where those that don't really believe will probably turn away, and those that do believe, God's people, will overcome their draw from him. And so there's that dual purpose of each of these items. This may make us uncomfortable to hear that God would, that would be so systematic in some ways about this, but this is his overall plan of judgment and faithfulness. Our faith is not one meant to make us comfortable here on earth. It's meant to refine us to look like people worthy of being with him forever. So conquest reminds us not to become too familiar with the systems destined to pass away, but rather to cling to God's system and to God's kingdom. One of those systems is nations, empires, and thrones. This is probably a good example of what we're living in right now. We have this global virus, this global pandemic that is circulating the globe. And not everybody, but some people are under the impression that the government is going to save us. And I think that the government has a lot of responsibility to do what it can to guide people to resolutions and solutions. However, at the end of the day, you can't fight a virus. All the government regulation in the world and these commands that everybody needs to stay in their homes. And I think that there's a place for it, don't get me wrong, but at the end of the day, the government's not going to save us from this. But people put their hope in governments and in leaders and in powers and in institutions like this to save us from things that are far beyond their ability. Does that make sense? And so, judgment like this kind of exposes, I think, the weaknesses and the insufficiencies of earthly systems. 2008, as hard as that was for so many people, is a phenomenal example of how putting your hope and your dreams and your confidences in the earthly economic system is destined to disappoint you. That could have been a form of judgment in which there was a wake-up call to say, oh, wait a minute, money and wealth are powerless. They evaporate, instantly. What are your thoughts or questions or reflections? I realize I kind of just spat a lot of thoughts and information at you guys very quickly. I'm guilty of that sometimes.
Well, when you asked about hardships, it reminded me of Gideon, that when the Lord came to Gideon, said, mighty man of valor, he said, God, how can God be with us when all these terrible things are happening? So he kind of went through the process of having his faith strengthened through that. Mm-hmm. He had a lot of tests for God, but God worked with him.
Yeah, he didn't really have a whole lot of options. So Gideon's like kind of the best he had there in history, which is saying something.
Right, right.
But yeah,
But
and that's
Gideon doubted at the very beginning, like, God can't be with us. These bad things keep happening
Mhm.
over and over.
yeah, that's a really, especially in the ancient world, when gods were thought to be nationalistic gods. The God of Israel was thought to be confined to Israel, and the Baal was thought to be confined to that nation whose name escapes me at this point. Of course, it does, but it would have been more like Syria and that region. And so part of even Elijah, we're going to do a sermon series on Elijah in a couple weeks. Part of the significance of God going to like the widow of Zarephath was not in Israel. It was outside of Israel's borders. And it's God saying, I'm not confined to a nation. I'm not like a geopolitical God. Sometimes we can fall into that mindset of, something happens to our nation. Oh no, our God must not be capable, or our God isn't here, or, our God is deficient in some way. And that is a common reaction, unfortunately, even today. But the reality is, and what John is kind of showing us, and what he's going to continue to show us, are a lot of these things: conquest, war, economic downturn, famine, disease, all this stuff that we look at and we go, oh no, God's out of control. Jesus is the one peeling off seals this whole time, and he's the one enacting judgment, but also in that enacting the refining of his people and moving the stage of history forward for his ultimate redemption. Which some people, admittedly, it's a difficult concept to realize that judgment can also be a redemptive act. But that's ultimately what Jesus is and what John is trying to show us here. All right, we're going to go to 11 and stop because I don't want to hold you guys all morning. Chapter 6, verse 3. When the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make men slay each other. To him was given a large sword. So we had a white rider that represented conquest, and now we have a red rider of war. Like conquest, war was a huge fear of ancient people. Red, this isn't hard to understand. This was associated with bloodshed. You see this bloody horse show up, you know what's going on. The reason war stands out so significantly to the Roman Empire was because of the period where this is written. They're presently living under the Pax Romana, which is the peace of Rome. It was this, huge. Rome had so much war in its past, and not just with other nations. It had a lot of civil war as well. Excuse me. And Caesar Augustus, that we read about in Luke chapter 2, he's actually the one that kind of ended all of this civil war, and he proclaimed that there would be a peace across Rome, the Pax Romana. And it was like, if you want to think of it in like his campaign platform, that was his talking point. The peace of Rome. I did this. I brought peace. Now, in reality, it was peace through force. It was subjugation of a lot of places. And that's why we find Roman soldiers garrisoned all over the place in the Roman Empire, especially in troublesome regions, because the minute uprising would show up, they just squash them. And so this peace was really a point of pride for the emperor and for Rome. And so, and honestly, you enjoyed it. If you lived in Rome and you lived according to the emperor's expectations of paying your taxes and going to the temple, the peace of Rome was awesome because it meant that you didn't have to worry about civil war and you could travel freely and do your business throughout the empire. However, this rider on a red horse, he threatens all of that. We're going to fall back into the chaos that we had 100 years ago, and no longer are we going to be free to go do our business. No longer are we going to be free to travel throughout the empire. No longer are we going to be safe in our homelands. War just, it strikes fear into people's hearts even today because we think, oh no, for a number of different reasons. Economically, what is this going to do? Is it somebody I know? Are they going to go to war? Am I going to lose somebody I care about? If it gets bad enough, well, is there going to be a draft? There's always some talk of that every time some new conflict shows up. War is just a scary thing for anybody, but particularly in this context because of the time of peace that they live in. So how might war function as part of God's judgment on this Roman Empire, on these people? It's just scary. It struck at unbelieving people, and it threatens the security and the sense of safety that you have in this earthly kingdom that is directly competing with God. And so there is, again, these things that the peoples of the earth, that technical term, are putting their hope and their trust and their faith in. God is systematically shaming and showing to be inadequate, basically, is what it is. Kind of the same way he in Egypt, when we have all those plagues, systematically he is striking at each of the Egyptian gods through the plagues, and he's showing one by one how inadequate they are and who the real God is. That's sort of what God is doing here with these seals. So we have the next question. If this is redemptive in some way, how might war serve a purpose in redeeming people? What can refine us about war?
We have to count on our faith.
It is a cleansing. War is also a cleansing.
It can be. I think this is going to be a common theme here. War breaks out. We have a very similar reaction to that of conquest. Some people turn away. Some people say, why would God allow this? Where is God? This is evil. This is wicked. God can't be good. Other people turn to God and they say, God, deliver us from this. God, keep us safe. God, protect my loved ones. God, lead us through this. There's kind of this defining thing that happens when these big cataclysmic things show up in our lives, where we either take one path or we take the other. And there's refining work, much like conquest, that can take place in us. If we put all of our faith, or we put too much faith in earthly systems and earthly kingdoms, inevitably we're going to be disappointed. Our faith is going to be shaken as these kingdoms start to disappear. And what are we going to be left with? Hopelessness, because nothing aside from God and his kingdom are permanent. But if we rather cling to God in these moments, we can be refined by them, and it can be cleansing and purifying really within us as these things are stripped away, or as Peter said in his book, as we are refined by fire in some ways. So we have yet another example of how I used the wrong button on my computer. We have another example of this terrible thing that people would look at and say, this can't be of God, is actually under the authority of God. Because again, Jesus is the one taking the seal off. He's the one that enacts this and really sets the stage, and in some ways proclaims it to happen. The point in that isn't necessarily to say, look, Jesus wants you to be at war. In fact, that's a terrible idea. That was used in the Crusades. That's probably not a good path to go down or a good interpretation. But rather, what we're seeing is that even as war breaks out and conflict breaks out, this is not beyond God's gaze or understanding. This is still part of his plan for history. This is part of his enacting judgment and redemption upon the earth and moving the wheels of history forward. Now, we may not like the way that sounds sometimes, especially when we're experiencing those conflicts in our lives. But that's the reality of what it means for God to be sovereign and God to be king. He writes history. He is kind and he is good, but he is also just and he is a judge. That's kind of a theme in this book too. All right, one more. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." I looked, there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand, and then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's wages, 3 quarts of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine." We don't trade in barley and wheat or quarts, and so this is a little confusing maybe. But at this time period, a day's wage is worth roughly a quart of wheat or 3 cups of barley. A day's wage for 1 quart of wheat or 3 cups of barley, like the creature says, is going to be somewhere between 10 to 15 times normal price So this is a highly inflated asking price for what's a meager amount of grain. 1 quart of wheat to feed a person for 1 day, and 3 quarts of barley. You can do a small family. Large families are going to struggle, and probably some people are going to starve to death if it's prolonged. So this is a writer of famine in some ways. The reason the prices are so high is because there's just not enough food to go around. Oftentimes famine is a result of war, so it makes sense that this would come after the red horse. This bit about olive and grapevines, well, we know this. You grow wheat every year. You plant it, comes up in the season. In fact, you plant it multiple times a year. It grows quick. Vines and vineyard type plants, they don't grow nearly as quickly, and they don't bear fruit nearly as quickly. Olive groves and vineyards, they take a long time, sometimes 10 to 15 years to grow back to the point where they can be productive. And so if you're conquering a land and all of its major money makers, the olive groves and the vineyards, are damaged, that land's kind of useless. And so most of the time during conquests, people would leave vineyards and olive groves alone, even if they might burn like wheat fields and stuff, just because if they do take the land, they want to be able to use it for something. And so again, this would be a common thing that you would hear in days of scarcity. It was just this incredible inflation. And the bit about the vines kind of gives us the indication that this comes as a result of war. Famine. How could famine be part of the plan of God? Well, we've seen it in the Old Testament. We saw it in the days of Joseph.
Rely on God for your daily provisions.
Yeah, Jesus taught us to pray that, didn't he?
Yes.
So, we have this instruction from God, give us this day our daily bread. Sometimes, in his case, he probably meant that literally. But still this idea that our provision comes from the Father, that our livelihood comes from him. We can put our security, and this is probably where 2008 fits in, we can put our security in our abundance, and we can put our hopes and our dreams and our faith and confidences in economic systems. We have no control over when, how, and to what extent they collapse or fold. It's really, when you think about it, and I think a lot of people learn this lesson, I hope they learn the lesson, it's foolish to put all of your trust in an economic system to be your savior. It's just not going to happen. It's going to collapse. We're in the middle of an economic downturn right now, and I know that our government is trying really, really hard to stimulate the economy and so on, and I hope it works. But the reality is, even if it does, small businesses and large businesses aren't going to recover very quickly. It's going to take time. Our stocks aren't just going to bounce right back. A lot of businesses are going to close. And so right now we're even seeing the effects of putting too much hope in an earthly economic system. In that same extent, and this, I'm just going to go ahead and click it because it's the same answer. How does famine serve a purpose in redeeming people? You can put your hope in flawed economic systems they're built on earthly rulers and earthly boasts, or you can, like Will said, you can put your faith in this God of provision. This is, Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6. Don't worry about what you'll eat or what you'll wear or what you eat or drink or wear. For the pagan runs after these things. Your Father in heaven knows that you need these things. He provides flowers for the grass of the field. He provides food for the sparrows. How much more valuable are you than these? This is at the heart of what Jesus is teaching us in the Sermon on the Mount, is where do we put our faith for our provision, and by that extension, our economic well-being, and just the stuff we need in our life. It can be refining in that, if everything collapses and hopefully I see the inadequacy of it all, my heart yearns to trust God more. Alternatively, I can grow bitter towards God because, you didn't provide like you said you would. I don't have all these things, or things are hard. And that's, again, one of those tough things to be in, those crucible kind of moments. And yet those are the kind of moments that God has used consistently throughout history to move things forward and to refine his people. You got time for one more? We can at least get through some horses. All right, verse 7 and 8. When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come," and I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind them. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. So Hades, we skipped these slides when they showed up the first time because we were surprised, running low on time. Hades, don't think of that as hell. That's a King James version translation of that word. It's not a very good translation. They did the best they could in 1611. They just didn't have a lot of resources at that time. But Hades is this concept of an underworld, not necessarily a place of punishment or anguish, but a place really just of kind of half existence that the dead would go. It's a Greek concept that shows up in the New Testament, similar to Sheol in the Old Testament. So the fact that Death has Hades following behind him doesn't mean that he's dragging hell with him and sucking everybody in. That's not the picture here. You got this pale rider of death or pestilence. Pale, Greek word there, sometimes means green. It's this kind of puke green, sickly color. Somebody might, placid is not the word, but they might flaccid, I don't know. Anyway, just a sickly green color is what's in view here. So because of this, you might think death by disease. You might think epidemic, you might think plague, something like that. Oftentimes those followed warfare. As armies would come in, as they lay waste to the land, it wasn't uncommon for disease and pestilence to kind of settle in an area as a result of all that. And the mention of plague in verse 8 kind of leads to this as well. Again, Hades, we covered that. So how can pestilence, how can disease be part of the plan of judgment? You know the answer to this by now. It impacts unbelieving people and their faith in earthly securities and powers. We today live in a culture that cherishes health, which is a good thing. We should do everything we can to stay healthy, but there does come a point where we have to realize we're still mortal people, and we can idolize our health. We can pour all of our resources and time and energies and affections into trying to maintain our health and trying to live as comfortable and pain/complication free as possible. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't cherish that, but there comes a point where we have to accept we are mortal. We have mortal bodies, and I'm not quite at that point yet, just because I'm just not. But from what I understand, there tends to be this point in a person's life, and correct me if I'm wrong, where you start to realize that most of your life is behind you and most of your health is behind you. And maybe the mentality starts to shift a little bit and we come to that realization. Is that the case? Is that fair to say?
I think so.
And I could easily see in that moment somebody having a choice between bitterness, and I've met people that are bitter because of that realization. And I could also see the choice of finding my satisfaction in something aside from my physicality. And I think that in our culture, this is kind of the tension there. Of just cherishing the physical and the temporal over the more significant. Not saying that we need to ignore our bodies or our health or anything like that. We need to be good stewards of things. But have this realization that we are not just physical bodies, and that our physical bodies are going to wear out.
That reminds me of Solomon when he said, "Vanities of vanities, all was vanity." Vanity were just a breeze, we come and go, and that's that.
Mm-hmm. I know it's kind of, it sounds crazy, but it's not surprising. But there's actually this growing movement and this growing push and expectation that we will come to view death as an illness with a cure, and that we will begin to treat it as such. And that's kind of a growing movement in futurist circles, but also in post-human circles, which sound like weird concepts, but it's actually becoming more and more common. And that whole concept to me is just odd. You know, we fear death so much. If we don't have hope, we put all of our trust in something earthly and temporal. And yeah, this horse definitely strikes at that, the idol of immortality, I guess. Same question: how is disease or pestilence part of redeeming people? It refines us. You know, we can put our hope and our trust and our faith in earthly things, physical things, temporal things, but healing and security will eventually elude us in life. But ultimate healing and security are found in the gift of God, and there is a lot of freedom and peace in that. So when does all of this occur? You know, and by that I'm not asking chronologically or historically, but in the context of the scene that we just read. Jesus is the one who opens these scrolls. Jesus is the one on the throne.
Amen.
Jesus is the one who's hailing in these horsemen of judgment in Revelation. So where is Jesus right now today?
At the right hand of the Father.
Still on a throne, right?
Yep.
So what do you think he's doing up there right now? You know, we talked about how we shouldn't view this as maybe a chronological or historical scene that this is going to happen, but rather this whole picture is the kind of thing that God is doing. This is what his judgment and redemption looks like. John doesn't seem to give us the indication that this is just going to be like a one-time thing. If his whole book is cyclical, if there's 3 series of 7, 7, 7, if God's judgment and redemption seems to be this unfolding thing that takes place over history, we're not excluded from that in our day and age. So things like war and conquest and economic disparity and disease, those are, and we've mentioned this, these all sound like things we experience today. They experience them, you know, I'm getting ahead of myself. You know, here's just a few examples. COVID-19, the Great Recession, 2008, ISIS, which they've kind of subsided to some extent. There'll be somebody else. You want to go back 100 years, it was the Spanish flu, it was the Great Depression. Not quite 100 years, you had World War II. You're going to go back even further than that. 1206, the Mongol conquest. The Mongolian Empire just began. It was 200 years. 30 million people died in those 200 years at the hands of the Mongols. They're largely responsible for spreading the Black Plague, which I think estimates are 200 million people died as a result of the plague. There's the economic fallout of that and trying to recover from that. So these, what we might look at and say that these are cataclysmic moments or these are defining tragedies of history. It's all cyclical. They come, they go, they repeat. There will always be another one until the last one. And that's kind of what I think John is trying to say here is, yes, these things will happen in the context of the Roman Empire, but church, because remember, this is written to 7 churches of Asia Minor, but this is written to 7 churches, the whole church, the full church. You're always going to experience these hardships. You're always going to be kind of collateral damage of God's judgment on godless cultures and systems in this world. Don't let that sway you. Be encouraged by it. Draw closer to the Father as a result of these things, and realize that while you experience the hardships of judgment today, there are also signs and promises of God's coming vindication too. Because if he keeps half his promise to judge, he's also going to keep his other half to bring life and victory. There's a powerful message in there that we experience even though it's hard. So yeah, we also need to understand that Jesus is using these things to guide history to a close. These aren't specific historical events, but rather they're just the kinds of forces. They're the tools in Jesus's toolbox. They're what he has always used and what a sovereign God always will use to move history forward. You can read through a little bit of philosophy of history, or just for yourself read some ancient history, and you start to see patterns show up a lot in different cultures and places. It's always a disease. It's always a conquest. A society always gets to its highest point of arrogance shortly before its decline and its demise. It happens again and again and again. This is what Rome's doing. I mean, the emperor is setting up a temple to be worshipped, and I'll say within 200 years from this point, things are going to change a little bit. Constantine will be the emperor, and Christianity becomes the legal religion. But then they start to experience all kinds of difficulty from within. They start to experience decline in culture. They start to experience decline in safety. They start to experience decline in education. This is what societies do. It's what kingdoms do. All that to say, this is not something that we're waiting for. It's something we're presently, in part, experiencing. Like we said, there will be a final, we'll call it a cycle or a final series. God only knows when that is, but his plans for judgment continue to unfold. Let's stop there today. Yeah, we'll pick that up next week. Closing thoughts, comments, or questions? We got heavy today. I don't want to discourage you. We're going to, maybe that's why John puts an interlude in there, now that I think about it, because it's a lot of heavy stuff. And maybe there just needs to be an emotional break for a little bit. We're not going to get there today, but this is going to be kind of the theme of the book for several weeks. Like I said, when we get to chapter 12, things take on a sort of a bigger life. But while there's hardship here, I hope we're also seeing the message of hope here, that the God is the one in control of all of this, that he is moving things forward, and that through these instruments, everything that's opposed to him in creation is kind of set in its place and shown for what it really is. A parody in some ways, if you want to use a term we introduced last week. All right, let's pray. Father, we thank you for this word. And I pray that as we process it, as we mull it over, and as we currently live through it, I ask that you would impress upon our hearts the significance of the hope we have in you. We know that this earth is fleeting. We know that the world system that is built on sin and rebellion is destined to collapse. And so we welcome your judgment on that which is contrary to your kingdom. We also pray for our hearts in the process, that we would cling to you, that we would have joy amidst difficulties, that we would have hope amidst the hopelessness that our world seems to experience. And I pray that that hope and that joy that we demonstrate and we exude would be so odd to our world that they would question why. How could these people find joy and gladness amidst challenge and difficulty? And I pray that in that your kingdom is revealed and that your reign is demonstrated. We pray also, Father, for our world as it experiences hardships right now, as it experiences that epidemic, and as it clings to fragile powers and as it's had its confidences shaken, Father, we know that there are many people that are questioning not just why, but are questioning what they put their faith in. And I pray that your truth would fill that void and that the unshakable nature of your kingdom would be seen and would expand. And Lord, we pray that you hasten the day where Christ is in full authority. He is in full authority, but that day where your reign is undeniable, and where the kings and the peoples of the earth fall to their knees and acknowledge who you are, and that all creation finally realizes the truth of your greatness. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, that is it for this week. Stop recording. Next week we will, in all likelihood, so here's a little update. So I read yesterday Governor Pritzker had said that corporate worship is now an essential function. It's an essential, I'm not going to call it a business, but an essential thing. However, you can only